Africa, good afternoon Europe, good evening Asia and the Pacific. My name is Linda Delen and I would like to welcome you to this first webinar of the course on managing a just transition to environmentally sustainable economies and societies. Thank you all for joining us. You've had a chance to introduce yourselves already on the forum. And we are really happy to have you here today with us. Some of you very early in your country, some of you very late. So thank you for joining. Before we move on, I would like to ask all of you to switch off your microphones if you're not speaking and to switch off your video if you're not speaking so that we can save a little bit of bandwidth. We have 1.5 hours together for this webinar. And before we start, I would like to present the team that is organizing this training course, Chanti Lanfranchi, who is the activity manager. You see her on the screen, Grace Restelli and Francesca Gialla. Who have been in contact with you and who've been supporting you in your registration and in being with us today. So that's the team. And I would then like to proceed with the presentation of the speakers that we have today. We have 3 speakers and their common topic today is the global context and agenda. Now we have with us here Mrs. Kusum Lata, the team lead on Mitigation Impact Assessment Support Unit of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Welcome, Kusum Lata. We have with us also Mustafa Kamal Gai, who is the Global Coordinator of the Green Jobs Program at the International Labour Organization. And we have with us Isabel Kempf, who is the head of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, Bonn office. The 3 of you, great experts on this topic of just transition. And the idea today would be for the 3 of you to make a short presentation, about 20 minutes per speaker. We are calculating. We then have half an hour for questions, for debate, and I would like to invite all of the participants to use the chat box. During the presentations, after the presentations, we'll try to keep an eye on the questions that you have. If you feel they are urgent, raise your hand. I hope you know how to do that. There's a little hand signal on your screen if you look at the list of participants, so that after those presentations we can deal with any questions, any comments you have, and any topics you would like to briefly discuss with these speakers. I think those are the main things I wanted to introduce and bring to your attention. So the first speaker is Mrs. Kusum Lata. As I mentioned, a team lead within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She is leading the team to support the negotiations and the implementation of work related to impact of implementation of response measures under the Paris Agreement, Convention on Climate Change and the Kyoto Protocol. And Kusum, if I'm not mistaken, your presentation today will be about the just transition in the context of climate change negotiations. I will make you the presenter now.
Thank you. So can you see the screen now?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, we can.
Okay, thank you for the nice introduction to the topic, what I would be speaking about and my roles and responsibilities. And it goes very in line, presentation goes very in line with the topic which I am presenting today, is to bring to all participants how just transition is actually being handled or being discussed or being negotiated when we are doing climate change negotiations. So the idea behind this presentation is to see how this just transition topic is covered and what kind of activities or work is being undertaken under climate change negotiations or in this framework which has been established on different streamlines of Paris Agreement as well. So just to be very clear right from the start that if you go to Kyoto Protocol, if you go to the convention, or if you go to the Paris Agreement, it could be highly possible that you will not see any word like just transition, exceptional for Paris Agreement, because it has been covered on the topic of response measures. How do I say that? Because what is response measure? It's basically impact of implementation of response measures. And when we talk about impact of implementation of response measures, we mean responses which are being taken by countries, which can be mitigation or adaptation, but we focus more on mitigation. So when mitigation responses are being taken to combat climate change by parties, there are some impacts of it as well. And these impacts can be positive, these impacts can be negative, these impacts can be within jurisdiction of the country where it has been implemented, it can be outside the jurisdiction. That means these are cross-border impacts. And when we see these impacts can be social and economical. So when we talk about social impacts, that is where the just transition topic comes in. So it is embedded wherever you see in convention or in the Kyoto Protocol or in Paris Agreement, any reference related to impact of implementation of response measures, you mean to understand that this is the area where all aspects related to just transition are being covered. So bringing that in perspective, when we say that today we have Paris Agreement, which has a goal to achieve 2-degree temperature below the industrial level 1990 levels, then this means that there will be a large amount of actions which will be taken to reach or to have that ambition. And when we are taking these mitigation actions, that means that the impacts will also be higher. So more actions, more impacts. And as I just said in my first slide to introduce the topic, that these impacts can either be within jurisdiction or with outside the jurisdiction of the country. And most of the time when these impacts are from country A to country B, they are coming because of the trade relationship between these countries. And it can be most of the time in the sectors, many of the sectors where the actions are being taken, and that can be within the country and outside the country as well. And one of the social impacts is that the jobs are being impacted. So you can imagine, like for a very typical example, if a country is closing down its coal-based power plants in a country, then the very direct impact within jurisdiction is that the jobs will be lost in this coal power plant. And the outside country impacts would be that any product which is being created through these power plants now were produced, then it has a different cost of production because of new plants coming in. And then these products can be does not make more as a cost. So your industry may not be that competitive within the world with other countries because of the higher cost. So these comes as a cross-border impact. It can also be that if a country A is implementing an action in a way that they put some kind of border carbon or border carbon standards, that any product this per ton of carbon has to be imported only, or they say that okay, anything beyond this carbon has to have a price, so it's a carbon pricing. Then once again, although you have not implemented anything in your country, but another country has implemented something in their country, you get an impact out of it. So these are the kind of impacts which a country receive without taking actions in your own country, or sometimes actions taken within your own country. And both these aspects have impacts on jobs. So going little more details, when I said these impacts can be positive and negative, definitely all these actions are taken with a motivation to reduce carbon emissions. So it does has positive impacts. It creates a lot of industries, new supply chains. So there are some positive impacts, but at the same time, as we said, there are some baseline scenarios where people are working in, or the economies, this particular product line is being stopped. You have to establish new product lines, or you have to establish new supply chains within your own country. And although these can also come as a negative impact to the economy or for the social. So it has a lot of social and environmental and economic impacts, which can be positive or negative. And when we talk about in this particular subject area, under the response measures, when we are transitioning to this low carbon or low emissions economies, we mean that this transition should be just transition. That means all these people, all these economies should be least impacted. And if they are being impacted, there should be some way so that we can minimize those impacts. And these are the things which are being discussed in these agenda items, or in these reporting lines, or in these frameworks. And then when we see like how these climate change negotiations have really gone forward from the time of 1992, when initial first UNFCCC convention was adopted, it has gone through a long way. And how just transition came into this, like it was not initially planned for, or it was not initially part of this very clearly mentioned. If you see Kyoto Protocol, if you see the convention, as I said, you will not see just transition very specifically mentioned in that. But later on, when we had our first forum, which was established, you can see here in 2011 and 2014 period, when the first forum on response measure was established, it had agreed to 8 work program areas. And one of the work program area was on just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs. So this is the time when I would say that very specifically you can see that just transition of workforce was embedded into the work plan and in climate negotiations very clearly. And continuing this practice now, I mean, initially they had 8 work program areas, but slowly they were focusing on what areas they have to work on, because that was the first time they started focused work on some of the relevant areas and trying to explore what is more relevant, what is less relevant, where the more work need to be done. And in this process in 2015, the focus was kept only for 2 work program areas, and one of them was just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs. And second work program area was on economic diversification and transformation. So all work related to response measures under climate negotiations was focused on these 2 topics. But how it developed later on, you can see that in 2016, before moving to 2016, I would say that even in Paris Agreement, we will see it a little bit in detail later on. In Paris Agreement also, just transition was very clearly mentioned in Paris Agreement. Then we move to specifically, again in the work plan or the work program of the forum, these initial work program were only for 3 years and 2 years. So now we have a 6-year work plan for the forum. What happened in 2018? In 2018, when this Paris Agreement negotiations continued, it was agreed that there will be new modalities which will be established for the forum, which is working on response measures. It should have new functions and it should have new work plan. And in that aspect, we will again cover later on a little bit in detail. That is where, again, just transition of workforce and creation of decent work and quality job continued. And now in 2019, last year in COP25, we received, we have agreed work plan for next 6 years. And there are many activities which are being implemented. And once again, these activities do relate to just transition. So this just gives you like how this just transition of workforce got embedded into the negotiations of climate change over the period from 1992 to 2019. I would say that major breakthrough came in when we had in COP16 that establishment of the forum, and in 2017 we in COP17 we got 8 work programs agreed to, and that was the first time it was officially came into the negotiations, and then it continued its journey till date. Let's look very briefly on convention provisions when we see that how it has been covered under convention. Here in the convention, it was only mentioned that when parties are implementing their commitments, they should take into consideration what actions are necessary in order to raise funding or for insurance, for technology transfer, and also to meet the specific needs and concerns of parties which are arising from impact of implementation of response measures. So it's basically requested, convention basically requested all parties to see what kinds of needs are arising for developing countries because of impacts of implementation of response measures. So that is how direction was given by the convention. And it also took into account on unilateral measures. So it's also said that whenever measures are being taken to climate change, it has to also see that including the unilateral measures should not constitute a mean of arbitrary or unjustifiable discrimination or a disguised restriction on international trade. And this is a very important clause of the convention, which basically tries that any country taking any unilateral measures, still it should not have any kind of impact in any kind of discrimination or disguised impact on the international trade, which is basically trying to see that no unwanted trade impacts comes on other countries across their border. When we come to Kyoto Protocol, it was a little more specific because it said that when countries are implementing their actions, then the parties also have to see that they have to really strive to implement their commitments in a way that they minimize adverse social, environmental, and economic impacts. So it actually not only told to consider, but it also said to you implement your things so that it minimizes impacts. So it acknowledges, it in a way acknowledged that there are some adverse social and economic impacts, and when you take actions, you should try to minimize impacts on developing countries. And in this convention, I have not listed here, but there were specifically different type of countries or parties which were listed, not the name of parties, but who can be possible vulnerable to these impacts. For example, countries who are largely dependent on fossil fuels, for example, coal or petrol or these kind of fuels which are coming from fossil fuels, or countries which are landlocked, or countries which are small islands because of their topography and geographical coverage. They are more adverse to these impacts, and those countries' impacts should be considered. Now, when we go to Paris Agreement, it was very important thing to see that in their preamble, it has acknowledged or it has recognized that parties are affected not only by climate change, but also by the impacts of measures taken to respond to it. So this was a very upgrade in a way that impacts of climate change and impacts of actions are kept at par. So you cannot say that impacts from the climate change coming like as a dissertation or many other impacts which we are receiving today, excessive rainfalls or loss of jobs, etc. Everything has to be considered equal to what impacts we are receiving because of my actions. So is the actions taken is equal to non-action? No, but yes, that is what they say, that impacts are equal. So you have to take them equally and seriously. The second thing which is good is that it has very clearly mentioned in one of the preamble that you have to take into account imperative of a just transition of the workforce and creation of decent work and quality jobs in accordance with your own NDCs which you have or your own development priorities. So if your priorities are towards the job, increasing job employment, so you have to keep that priority. So when you are implementing your NDCs, you have to keep into account the priorities of your own workforce and creating good, decent quality jobs when you are implementing your actions. So this was a very good aspect which brought into Paris Agreement. Other than that, Paris Agreement, again, which I mentioned initially, that they agreed to continue the forum. And they also said that when you are implementing your actions, once again, they said parties has to take into consideration the concerns which are coming from economies most affected by impact of response measures. So in this way, instead of highlighting which countries, which type of countries, or developing countries, so they basically covered that consider all economies which are affected by response measures. Now, like, how do we see, like, whether countries are, if they are taking actions or not taking any actions, is it being reported anywhere? Because this is a normal concern we are having, that most of NDCs are not having any particular target on this aspect of just transition or on the jobs creation. Some of them have, but I think it's not very prioritized, or it is not coming out very evidently. But there are some ways and mechanisms where if countries want to report, they can report on these impacts as well. Because if we see the enhanced transparency framework, in this enhanced transparency framework, the modalities which have been developed for reporting in the last COP, it says in paragraph 78 that countries have to report on social and economic consequences of response measures. I have highlighted them blue in this slide. And the D part is that actions to address these consequences. So if countries want to report on their actions, like what kind of consequences you are receiving. So if I'm a developing country or a developed country, then if you want to report on that, oh, I am receiving these kind of impacts from actions taken by me or by somebody else, then I can report here because there is a reporting guideline here. And then what actions has been taken to address them. So if you are a developed country, sometimes developed countries would also like to have some reporting done, what kind of actions they have taken to address those consequences or minimize the impacts, because there is a reporting requirement under the convention for such kind of support which are being provided by developed countries. So now we are not having under ETF any kind of developing country discrimination. So any country who would like to report on this, they can make use of these provisions. In addition, there is another requirement under the ETF, which is for all parties and which encourages them to provide a detailed information to the extent possible on assessment of economic and social impacts of response measures. So what kind of assessments countries have undertaken to understand social and economic impacts, and anything else they have done to address them or to mitigate those impacts. Coming back to the forum, forum had, I mentioned, like very recently after Paris Agreement, this forum is a body, not a body, is a structure which has been created, which works on all aspects related to response measures, and it reports to all three bodies. So this is one single forum now, which reports to all the three bodies on just transition related matters, along with other areas as well. In addition, and after the Paris Agreement, and when they agreed to new modalities, functions, etc., then a new constituted body was established, which is titled as Katowice Committee of Experts on Impact of Implementation of Response Measures. And this is a technical body now. So we have a forum. Initially, we had forum up to 2015 till the time we had Paris Agreement. We only had forum. Now, after Paris Agreement, when we agreed to new modalities in 2018, we got this constituted body as a technical body. So this technical body now reports to forum, and forum reports to SB subsidiary bodies. So forum reports to all the three bodies also, because it reports to COP, CMP, and CMA. But KCI, which is constituted body, it only reports to the forum, and it takes care of all technical work which need to be done related to response measures, including just transition. After this decision in 2018, we also got enhanced clarity what are the functions and what is the work of the forum and its KCI, and they have developed now a 6-year work plan. If we look into new functions, so what work they do, we are talking about just transition is included, but exactly what they are doing. So what they do is that they provide a platform to share information, experiences, case studies, best practices, and views. So it's a platform which allows parties, experts to share information related to what they are doing related to response measures in their own countries. What is the best practices? In addition, it also, the function of the forum is also to facilitate assessment and analysis. So they are also facilitating how the impacts of response measures can be assessed and analyzed. So in this way, when we talk about when they come to just transition, they will try to facilitate what kind of methodologies can be used in order to assess what are the job impacts of particular type of a climate policy and how we can address this. So those kind of things, assessment and analysis, are incorporated into the work. Then also they provide concrete examples, case studies, and best practices in order to enhance the capacity of parties. So here the idea is that capacity of parties are being enhanced by themselves so that they are able to undertake their own case studies to assess these impacts. So we are working on three, like share information, then they also facilitate assessment and analysis, and they also provide some examples and case studies so that capacity of countries are being enhanced. Now, when they do all these 3-4 functions, in which areas we do? We are focusing today on just transition of the workforce, which is second bullet on this particular slide. But other than that, they also have other 3 program areas, which is on economic diversification and transformation, assessing and analyzing impacts of implementation of response measures, facilitating the development of tools and methodologies to assess impacts. So there are 4 work program areas, but just transition is only one of the areas on which this forum and this KCI and climate change negotiations are focusing on. If we see the work program, if we, in there, it also allows for enhancing the collaboration. So work program says, okay, now you have these functions, but how do you do these functions? So work program, it says that you have to enhance cooperation with parties. When you are implementing all of this, you have to enhance collaboration with stakeholders, external organization, experts. So that is why you will see when they're implementing their work plan, they will try to have inputs from parties, from the experts, from institutions, etc. In addition, when they, even in order to enhance cooperation, they have also, when they made a composition of KCI, then 2 seats are also reserved for the international intergovernmental organizations. And these intergovernmental organizations, so that they are able to contribute in this whole process as well. And just to let you know that ILO and EBRD are 2 of our intergovernmental organizations who are serving on KCI with this idea of enhancing cooperation and bringing their views for implementation of work. The second thing is that enhancing capacity and understanding of parties. And for this particular work program, Forum is trying to organize a lot of workshops for enhancing capacities and understanding, which are awareness creation workshops in countries. And these workshops are also being implemented with stakeholders, and ILO is one of our very active stakeholder in bringing this understanding related to just transition at the local level. The third aspect is promote actions to minimize adverse impacts. And here we are working with countries so that they are able to plan their mitigation policies in a way that it is able to minimize negative and maximize the positive impacts. So those are being assessed while the policy is being planned itself. If we see the work plan of the forum, it was agreed. I have not put a lot of details here for the 6-year work program. This is for 6 years, so it's a very huge table. And it has almost 15 activities, and I have provided a link here, which takes you straight to the work plan, which was agreed in 2019, last year, December COP. Again, this work program covers 6 years. It has 4 work program areas, and one of the area is just transition of workforce. And you will see that there are a large number of activities which are being specifically relevant to just transition of workforce. by taking into account inputs from experts, practitioners, and intergovernmental organizations. So you can keep a watch on this. Like there will be a lot of time call for inputs which will be coming in where we would like to express your views or your opinion or your inputs to be made to be considered while those activities are being implemented. And I would really encourage you to go through this work plan later on at the time you are available and have time. So this is the latest thing. Feel free to reach me on this email address if you have any questions later on after this for this webinar. And this provides you a very comprehensive update how we started, where we are, and what kind of activities we are implementing, and what kind of institutional arrangements are in place to cover this transition of workforce in climate change negotiations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kusum. Thank you for an excellent presentation. At this point in time, I would like to ask if there's any urgent need for clarification, because certainly we are planning time for discussion at the end of the webinar, but if there's any urgent questions on the presentation that you just saw from Kusum, please raise your hands. Otherwise, we move on to the next. No urgent questions? Good. Then we leave that discussion to the end of the webinar. And I would like to present again Mustafa Kamal Gay, the Global Coordinator of the Green Jobs Program at the International Labour Organization, working to promote positive employment outcomes of policies on climate change, green economy and the sustainable development. And Mustafa, your presentation today, if I understand correctly, is about managing a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all, and the opportunities and challenges for the world of work. So if you could share your screen, let us also move the presenter mode over to you. I think that's already working. Excellent. Mustafa, can you unmute yourself?
Well, thank you, Linda and colleagues. It's a pleasure to join you at this session. I would be speaking on the ILO overhaul framework for a just transition. So my presentation will touch upon two dimensions. The first one will be to share perspectives in terms of what do we understand by a just transition in the world of work. And why environmental sustainability, and for this matter, climate change is important for the world of work. And the second part, I will speak of the framework that we have for policy making and country support to make a just transition possible for all. So I would like to draw your attention to the title of my presentation, which speaks of managing a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all, opportunities and challenges for the world of work, and focus on the point that speaks to economies and societies for all. So this is so because as we in the ILO are a tripartite organization, made up of representatives of governments, workers' organizations, and employers' organizations, the way we see the impacts of environmental change and climate and policy responses is through the lens of governments. But not only that, we also working with employers and workers' organizations. And so this three dimension is quite critical. And beyond that, we also are aware of the impacts of communities and society at large, and that is why this title refers to economies and societies for all. Now, the first part is about the impacts of climate change on decent work and the world of work in general. So we're referring to two types of impacts, and I think Kusum framed it very well in the sense that climate change, as we know it as a physical phenomenon, has impact on economies and societies and people. But on the other hand, when governments take measures to address climate change, those policies that Kusum outlined very well will also impact on economies and societies. So now if I move to the next part, which is specifically on why environmental sustainability matters for the world of work, is for the very reason that we are aware that a healthy environment is a basis for economic activity. So when we talk of inputs that make economic activity happen, we refer to we refer to usually to financial capital. We refer to labor as social capital, but we often overlook the environment, which is the natural capital assets of our economies. Now, the fact that we have fertile soils, that we have clean water, we have standing forests, we have clean air that we breathe, all of that is what makes economic activity possible. So therefore, we've measured in the ILO that not less than 1.2 billion jobs are very much linked to ecosystems and the services that ecosystems provide. One typical example is the fishing industry, which employs over 86 million people. So as fish stocks collapse, we can imagine the impact that it will have on the fishing industry, the workers, the enterprises, and communities that depend on that economic sector. We also are aware that in many of our societies, people living in rural economies, in particular the indigenous and tribal peoples, derive a lot of their subsistence, their source of income, their medicine from natural capital and the health of ecosystems. So this is therefore quite important for us in the world of work. Now, there's another dimension which is important, which is that natural disasters, the natural catastrophes, the environmental risks that we see across the world, all of this impacts negatively on the world. And I would just emphasize two of them. One is what we can refer to as human-induced or enhanced natural disasters around the world. We've measured that between the year 20 and 2015, millions of working lives have been lost around the world as a consequence of natural disasters. We can think of hurricanes that are very recurrent in a country like the Philippines. We can think of flooding in Southern and Eastern Africa. But when you look at this impact in terms of working life years that have been lost, it's tremendous. Asia and the Pacific being mostly affected, followed by Africa and the Americas. Now, I refer to another physical phenomenon for which I have not put a graph, but which is the phenomenon of the warming of temperatures, and which we refer to as the factor of heat stress. Now, this is very common in the work of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC has measured over several years and even decades how much the warming of temperatures is going to cost to economies in terms of financial losses. But what has not been done up until now was to measure the impact of heat stress on labor productivity. So last year, the ILO published a report that I hope we will find on the eCampus, working on a warmer planet. And in that report, we measured the cost of the loss of productivity in the world as a consequence of warming. And what that report finds is that on average, by 2030, with the current patterns, it's likely that 2% of total working hours will be lost around the world. And if you turn that 2% of total average into full-time employment, we're talking of 80 million jobs that will be lost. Regions most likely to be impacted will be Southern Asia and Western Africa, where it will be about 5% of total working time. If you just consider Western Africa, it would be close to 10 million jobs that would be lost as a consequence of warming of temperatures. Now, what we have also tried to do, which Kusum outlined in the beginning, is to understand broadly the nature and scale of changes that are likely to happen in the world of work if countries take action to address climate change. And I would like here, colleagues, to start with a very clear narrative, because there is a debate about the narrative on climate action. Some believe that ambitious climate action will lead to so much disruption in economies, societies, and loss of jobs, and therefore it is important to manage the scale of action so that we minimize the disruption. And that's what they refer to as just transition. And I'd like to say that that is a very, very different a narrative than the one we are advocating and pursuing in the world of work. Our message is that it is not action against climate change, but it is rather inaction that will cause devastating impacts on the world, on economies, societies, and jobs. What we have found last year when we did an assessment of what will be the impact of pursuing the 2-degree target of the Paris Agreement is that it will lead to net job creation for most regions in the world. Now, what you see in this graph is the result of that analysis, which was focused on the energy sector. We looked at a larger deployment of renewable energy, improvements in energy efficiency, and the use of electric vehicles on a larger scale. And we find with that the world will see in total 24 million jobs possible by 2030. However, in some parts of the world, there will be risks of loss of jobs, and this is very much concentrated largely in the Middle East and in some parts of Africa. So I will come maybe in the discussion on the reasons for this, but essentially it is in regions of the world where economies will keep depending more than other places on fossil fuels, while the rest of the world is moving away from the fossil fuel economy. But the key message is that it is a positive narrative. It is a net job gain in the order of 18 million. Now, because I've spoken about job creation, job losses, income generation, income loss, that's why we think it is important to manage that transition. And when we say managing a just transition at the ILO, what we mean is putting in place policies, institutional mechanisms that will be able to maximize the opportunities for income generation and job creation while minimizing the losses to the economy, society, and people, so that out of this process, nobody is left behind. Now, to do that, the ILO constituents have discussed in 2015 through a tripartite meeting of experts where governments nominated experts, workers nominated experts, and employees nominated their experts. And that meeting produced what we call the guidelines for a just transition towards environmentally sustainable economies and societies for all. Now, the guidelines are, I would recommend that you please take a look at them, but to just summarize the key elements of it, first, it speaks to the importance of policy coherence and effective institutional arrangements. So here it is about ensuring coherence between the climate change policies, the labor policies, policies on skills development, and other areas of policy making. And it also speaks to institutional arrangements where it's about promoting social dialogue among actors in society and ensuring that this is not just a business for ministries of environment and those who negotiate climate change, but all actors in the real economy are part of policy-making processes. Now, the guidelines point to 9 key areas of labor market policy, which we believe could be essential if combined with climate change policies. So they are about macroeconomic and sectoral policies, including industrial policies, policies on employment and employability of people. Here it's about enterprise development, skills development, labor markets, and finally measures of social protection, which refer to occupational safety and health. And this is again important in relation to the issue of heat stress I just referred to, and then social protection. I would just want to focus now on 2 of these policy areas, the one on skills and the one on social protection. Now, skills are important in particular for 2 reasons. The first one is that when we measure that there is a potential for 24 million jobs in the world economy, in the green economy, this job potential is not going to happen by default. It will require transitions. It will require reskilling of the workforce. It will require that we build the skills in new occupations that are emerging so that this potential for job creation is materialized. The second dimension of skills is to allow for a smooth transition so that in sectors of the economy that will be contracting, like to go back to Kusum's example, countries shutting down their coal production, how could we ensure that workers, enterprises in that industry can enter other occupations and allow that transition to happen in a smooth way? Skilling, reskilling will be an essential part of that. Now, last year, the ILO did a report, Skills for a Greener Future, where we did 32 country studies and put it together in a global report. I think this is also going to be available in the e-campus, so you can see the global report and country studies. But what I'm trying to show here is that we anticipate skill demand in certain sectors of the economy, demand for skills declining in other areas of the economy, and it's important that we understand this big picture and also contextualize it in national economies so that in every country our members and partners and actors have a sense of where skills will be required to attain their climate objectives, and where they have gaps existing today, where they would have to anticipate skills coming into the future so that there is again this coherence between skills making and the climate ambition. And second, social protection. We believe it is essential to protect workers in this transition. Social protection is, of course, important in its own stake. And colleagues, you know that today we have huge deficits in social security, which the current COVID-19 pandemic is underscoring, that 70% of people around the world have no or inadequate social security. So therefore, all those workers in the informal economy across Latin America, across Africa or Asia, who are in lockdown, not benefiting from social security, have no means of income, no ways to compensate their loss of revenue, and this is being exacerbated by the current COVID-19 pandemic. But in the context of climate change, we see many ways to use social protection policy both for climate change mitigation and adaptation so that we can enable a just transition. But here I just want to refer to cash transfers, for example, and employment benefits. We can also use public employment programs or payment for ecosystem services. So these are all different ways to use social security to support climate change. But I would maybe come later if we have specific questions and if time allows in our discussions. I just wanted to highlight the last point I mentioned on the opportunity we see to combine social and environmental objectives in policy measures, in particular public employment programs and payments for ecosystem services. In our report of last year, we find that if you review today the public employment programs, very luckily about 50% of them integrate an environmental dimension. So this is about rebuilding ecosystems. This is fighting about soil erosion, reforestation programs, and all this is all beneficial, not only for job creation, but also for climate adaptation and mitigation. Now, I would like to end just sharing some example of the programs that the ILO is working on. We work with many of members and our constituents in this course to support their actions on climate change while putting jobs and livelihoods at the center of climate action. And there is a new initiative that the UN Secretary General, together with the Director General of the ILO and leaders of employees organizations and workers organizations have launched last year. This was during the context of the UN Climate Action Summit. In the Climate Action Summit, we engaged with a number of countries under the leadership of Peru and Spain to encourage countries to commit that they will develop national plans and strategies for a just transition. And out of that process, 46 countries have made a firm commitment that they will develop national plans for a just transition so that we ensure that as countries scale up climate action, the social dimension, employment and labor will be taken on board as well as just transition. So you have these countries and maybe we can share more information on what countries are doing. I would just wanted to end by sharing this image, which is when the Just Transition, the Climate Action for Job was formally launched during the UN Climate Change Conference in Madrid last year, in the presence of the UN Secretary General, the Director General of the ILO, the Federal Minister of Environment of Germany, the Minister of Environment of the Ecological Transition of Spain, Minister Ribera, the Secretary General of the International Organization of Employers and the General Secretary of the International Trade Union Confederation. We also had the youth champion in the launch, as well as Poland ambassador for climate change. So this is our roadmap, and this is our plan going forward to work with countries to build a strong coalition advocating and advancing just transition at the global level. But then more importantly, at the national level, work with our member states to help and support their initiatives so that national plans on just transition be put forward based on strong analysis of the job opportunities, social dialogue, skills that will be indispensable for a just transition, social protection, and international cooperation. So Linda, thank you. Colleagues, I'm just going to end here. I hope I have not spoken too long. I cannot see the watch on my screen, unfortunately.
Thank you so much, Mustafa Kamal Gai. Thank you for a very clear presentation. And I would like to give participants the opportunity, if there's any immediate clarification they would like to ask for on this presentation. I see a lot of questions whether people will have the presentations. For sure you will have them on the eCampus. If you need a clarification, please raise your hand right now. Otherwise, we move to the next. Okay. I would then like to present again Mrs. Isabel Kemp, head of the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development Bonn office. Isabel leads the program on integrating knowledge and capacity development for the Sustainable Development Goals. And her topic today is the just transition in different contexts and its potential to transform economies. Isabel, can I hand over to you?
Sure, you can. Yes. Thank you. Can we have the slides? Yeah, before I start, I wanted to say to all participants, how happy I am to connect with you through virtually. I think that's really good for the planet. For me, as someone who likes to work and share with others, because I've seen from the participants list that there's a very rich experience here in the room. I'm very sad that we cannot see each other and not have like a very interactive dialogue, but that's for next time. Okay, I would like to look a little bit at the question. Just transition for what, and what does it look like in concrete terms, providing some concrete country examples. Yeah, next slide, please. Yeah, I mean, as you probably know, there has been a whole evolution of the concept. It has really started with workers' unions and frontline communities, who were the first kind of, so to say, labor environmentalists, advocating for safer working conditions and better environmental standards. But it has been taken up recently by the mainstream, and mainly also as an advocacy term during the climate change negotiations, as we've seen as the colleagues have already presented. Really, I mean, the kind of international and national trade unions have been using it. Sustained Labor has been training national trade unions on that concept, and it found its way into the Paris Agreement, as we saw. ILO has also the Just Transition Agenda and program that Kamal has been presenting, and most recently, now in January 2020, also the European Green Deal introduced a just transition mechanism, and I will explain that a little bit more in the coming slides. But the question is now, just transition to what? Does just transition still have its very transformative meaning? Do we want to really have more environmentally sustainable economies and more just societies? And how can we really use just transition to advocate for the necessary social and ecological transformation? So I'm looking a little bit also at the what and what societies really would like. Next, please. Well, as you all know, in 2018, the Yellow Vest movement in France really showed the dilemma when you kind of don't implement integrated policies, but when you start from one end, climate change without social policies, and which led to, in the case of France, led to rising fuel prices, and the protest against the tax reform really falling on the back of the workers and the middle classes, and especially in rural areas where it was difficult to get around without a car, for example. And interestingly enough, while most of the protesters really would like to combat climate change, they are also seeing kind of other parts, the social and the justice side, that needs to be part of that package. So they're asking for minimum wage increases, lower fuel taxes, having a solidarity tax on wells, and really being more kind of part of the decision making, basically. And I think also this claim to have not the poor pay for the pollution, but really let the polluters pay more, that's something that has come out very strongly also in the protest. Next slide, please. When you compare that to the German Energiewende, which was much more kind of bottom up, I would say, where eco-tax was more or less implemented through pilot projects. For example, people could put solar energy on their houses and then sell the home-produced energy to the grid. And that really led to a kind of a slower increase of renewable energy, and also to job creation, because it was very decentralized. And as even now, I mean, the Energiewende and the transition has a very high approval rate by the population of nearly 90%. But even with that very high kind of level of trust and participation in the energy transition, a very high percentage of the population wants to have poor families have the adequate access to energy services, so kind of have an energy democracy. They don't want tenants to pay more when upgrading to more energy efficient buildings. And they also ask for big polluters pay higher taxes. So we can see that both in the French and in the German examples, the population really wanted to ensure that environmental and social policies go hand in hand. Next slide. So there are really different levels of ambition when we look at just transition. I think one, as we can see in many countries where there is a big reliance on coal, really the ambition of just transition is to compensate the coal workers, or in this kind of, in the area that will be most affected. So either the sector, the employment, and the industry that is really affected most or will lose most when going from brown to green. The second level of ambition is a bit more really focusing on workers' rights and social protection, and also the distribution of benefits and costs. And that is what we saw when we looked at the French and German populations' demands. So really kind of making sure that workers get unemployment benefits, that they are protected by social protection measures, and that the big polluters pay higher taxes. So that is part of the managerial kind of reform ambition. Then if we go a step further, there's also the ambition of structural reform. So that is really to address inclusive and equitable decision-making and procedural justice. Within the climate change negotiations, we have that concept of common but differentiated responsibilities. And I'm sure my climate change colleagues will be able to explain that a bit more. And then the whole question is, what kind of society do we really want? And how can workers, the population, and also businesses be really involved in the decision-making of, how such a just transition, what should it look like? How would we, who will benefit from it? And what are the kind of goals that we all agree upon as a society? And then I think the most ambitious part would be to really transform the economic and political system into a system that would be more ecologically and socially just. So I think that's really the transformative aspect of just transition. And I'll provide a few examples in the next slides. Next, please. So if we look at the different kind of axes here, so we have the axis in the horizontal axis, which is more inclusive versus less inclusive. One that's more transformative, the vertical axis, leading to a new vision, or one that is more defending the status quo and making sure that no harm is done. And I think the different examples that we have here is maybe to start with the example of South Africa, where there is a debate on the compensation for fossil fuel workers, especially coal miners, because coal provides around 80% of South Africa's total energy generation, and yet 40% of the population is regarded to be energy poor, which means has either no access or little access to energy. So here the question is, how can you solve that question of compensation for workers who will lose their jobs, and at the same time make sure that all the population has access to energy. And I think here the question is really then becomes a question of not only securing a just transition for coal workers and communities, but also of providing adequate and affordable access to electricity, and then stimulate economic growth and jobs. And here the question is really, can there be a united front of trade unions, environmentalists, women's groups, and also youth groups to agree on the vision? Because without that vision, there is a big risk of just staying within the status quo. The second example that I wanted to share is a little bit the just transition mechanism of the European Green Deal. I put that in the middle, but I'm not sure where exactly it should be, whether it should be more inclusive or less exclusive, because it's part of the European Green Deal, and it was launched in January of this year. So it has not yet been implemented. But it really, the just transition mechanism will provide around 100 billion of investments for the next 7 years. And it will provide financial support, transition plans, and also risk-sharing public sector funding to make sure that workers can get new skills, that there will be more energy efficient housing, that there will be less energy poverty, and that really everyone will have access to affordable and secure energy within the European Union. As I said, as this is a little bit at the moment in a top-down way, because it's the Commission that suggested that, we'll have to see that when it's being implemented, how participatory it will be and how transformative it will be. But I think what's interesting when we look at the just transition mechanism is that it will provide investment for just transition. And I think that's one of the most ambitious just transition mechanisms that exist at the moment. And I think the fact that they really would like to provide incentives for the private sector also to really be part of the just transition seems quite interesting. The third example I wanted to give is a community-driven example from a town called Jackson in the US. And it's called Corporation Jackson. It's an initiative from the grassroots that aims at empowering local communities to create really its own solidarity economy through green cooperatives, eco-villages, and green buildings at the municipal level. And it has had a lot of support actually from the local trade unions, but also from some of the local social churches, which has been quite interesting. And they really wanted to do two things. On the one hand, they wanted to show how solidarity economy can work in practice, but then also participate in different, state, federal, and international political spaces. For example, they're also a member of the Climate Justice Alliance. So I think here it's really interesting to see, coming from the grassroots, bringing a vision of transformation, because they really also want to address racial, gender, and other injustices while going green. How they were able to influence, not only by providing concrete examples at their own level, but also trying to influence the international debate. So I think here we have a little bit of an example of, where transformation is really the ultimate goal of just transition. Next, please. I think what this debate shows is really that there is really an important need for integrated approaches and policy coherence, that you cannot, now go green and redistribute later, that you have to make this part of a single development agenda, that you have to know what your goal is, what kind of society and what kind of economy would you really like to have, that this needs to be decided through social dialogue. As Kamal already showed, that's a really important part of just transition, because there's not one actor who can decide for everyone else. And that is also very important to do a good institutional contextual analysis to see, where are the gaps in the budget? Because even if you have a good integrated plan or policy, you need money and you need investment to make it happen. And then also to kind of the link between the national and the local level. In the case of South Africa, now they're introducing quite a number of green bonds at the municipality level, because many of the trade unions kind of advocated for producing renewable energy at the municipality level, because they think that will ensure better access of the population. But then how do we kind of make sure that there is coherence between the national policy and the implementation at the decentralized level, and that the money follows? And then again, you know, how can we, through social dialogue, make sure that everyone is really involved in that discussion? What kind of society and what kind of economy do we want to have? And I can see that now with the COVID-19 crisis, the call for transformation of society and the economy is very loud again. So I think the just transition is a very timely concept, and I hope that we will see many more countries and communities now advocating for just transition. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Excellent presentation. Lots of interesting case studies, as was also commented on the chat. Thank you for that. We have 20 minutes for questions, for comments, and you know, you can raise your hand, you can write on the chat box. And since I missed somebody raising her hand right after the presentation of Mustafa, I would now like to give that person the floor. Maria del Carmen Llamas, you had a question particularly on the previous presentation. Please go ahead.
Yes, sure. Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Well, to Mustafa, you talk about loss of green jobs in 2030 in Africa and Middle East countries. Can you explain the reason? Why is the negative difference so extreme? You said that you could talk about it a little bit more, and I mean, it's a huge difference between another countries and this part of the world, and I want to know why is the reason. And about the social protection system, I didn't see a clear correlation between that and a good environment measures. Can you put some examples or to say something to help me to understand the correlation between that? Thank you.
Linda, shall I just proceed?
Yes, please.
Yes, well, thank you. These was very relevant questions. So the first part, when in the presentation, the data we had from our assessment of the impacts of implementing the Paris Agreement, it shows net job creation in most regions, but some decline mostly in the Middle East and partly in Africa. And this is essentially because in the scenario we use, the world is moving away from fossil fuels, oil, gas, and natural gas and coal towards renewables. And this is, if you remember, the indication from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change is that in order to achieve the targets of the Paris Agreement, by the end of this century, the world should stop using totally any fossil fuels. So therefore, the direction towards a low carbon economy is a decline in demand for oil and gas and fossil fuels in general. So in that scenario, economies that will keep depending more than others on fossil fuels, and that's why we see that in the Middle East are the ones likely to see decline in employment. So that's what explains the figure in the Middle East and partly in Africa. Now, on the point on social protection and how social protection can help with environmental sustainability and the climate agenda, I have tried to just put it generally to say that when people have a social security, they are protected in general against income loss, income of their business assets. But one of the ways through which we've been working at the ILO with our member states is, for example, to provide mechanisms to counter loss of income due to flooding or due to crop failure. So, for example, in the Philippines, but also in Ethiopia and Kenya, we've done pilot projects using a weather-based index for an insurance mechanism. So the weather-based index mechanism allows farmers to subscribe to an insurance so that when the weather index is hit, and which is an indication that it's likely that they will see a crop failure in that year, their loss of income can be compensated through that mechanism. So there are many other examples like that. You know, if you see in Africa, the Africa risk mechanism is one of them. They all counter the climate impacts, but we feel that this could be made systematically as part of social protection policies, because at the moment these are like standalone measures, but if they were integrated in social protection, so that the you know, for in this current pandemic, a lot of those who are not working in Europe or elsewhere still get their revenues because of social security. Imagine if we could have loss of income and jobs as a consequence of climate change also covered through social protection. While we expand the coverage, I think it will make societies more resilient, workers and communities as well more resilient. So that's the way we're thinking of combining social protection with measures for adaptation and mitigation against climate change.
Thank you for that, Mustafa. I would like to give the floor to Sianda Siko and from there to Ioannis Goutsamanis. Sianda?
Thank you so much, Linda. I've jotted my question on the chat, but I'm happy to repeat it. And what I'm essentially saying is that from literature, just transition has always been dominated by two frames of analysis, which is the procedural and distributional justice. And up until recently, we've seen the emergence of restorative justice, which is more concerned about jobs. But I think my question is really centered around what has been then the biggest obstacle thus far that has prevented financing a just transition to a low carbon and climate resilient economy. Thank you.
Shall we take Ioannis' question straight away and then ask for the speakers to respond? Ioannis?
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you perfectly well.
Hi. Well, this is not exactly a question. This is more like a comment and a remark regarding the first and the last presentation. Obviously, I'm in favor of the just transition, but my remark, especially for the Paris Agreement that we worked with ITUC and ETUC, is the fact that the just transition term was in the preamble instead of the main document. And I wrote this on the forum as well, because I believe this is a very, very important thing, that it lost some of its validity being in the preamble. This is my opinion, and not only my opinion anyway. Also, regarding some further steps that I saw in the presentation, I believe that it was also a very important period in the Katowice, which most of the countries signed the Silesia Declaration for the Just Transition. And I'm saying this because now we have to lobby as trade unionists for the national determined contributions to our governments, and we have a letter explaining how they have to put on the national determined contributions the just transition terminology, as well as some of the plans to fulfill the just transition terms. And because the problem with some of the examples, especially in the Western Balkans, especially in Bulgaria and Czech Republic, is that the coal power plants are being closing. The problem is that many people are without a job. For example, in Bulgaria, there was a coal power plant that was actually closed, but there were 300 people unemployed. So there wasn't a just transition. It was a fast transition to a low carbon economy, but it wasn't a just transition. So that's my remarks for the time being.
Thank you, Sianda. Thank you, Ioannis. I would like to give the speakers the opportunity to respond to those issues.
Yeah, maybe. Can I?
Go ahead, Isabel. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, I would like to respond to Sianda's question. I think it's really very relevant. You know, the question is, why has it not happened? Yeah, why is there not really proper financing of just transition? And I think there are two reasons. I think for a very long time, the political response to the protest has been, you know, either employment or the environment. So I think it really kind of for a very long time, I think the political discourse was that, yeah, either we protect jobs or we work in favor of climate change. And I think it's only in the last, I don't know, I mean, in the last COPs and in the last 10 years that really people kind of start to say we need both because there are no jobs on a dead planet, yeah. So I think this is really the first kind of integrated policies, how can they work? So I think that's the first thing. The second, why there is little financing, is also that the top-down approaches that have been tried, for example, I showed the example of France, you know, with an increased fuel tax, in order to then finance some of its climate program, has met with protests because they were not integrated. So I think if you only do climate change mitigation policies without the social part, it will also not work. So that's number two. And I think number three is also that you really need to provide a buffer or a risk-sharing finance from the public sector to the private sector. Because some of the renewable energies have maybe a higher risk involved. So I think the idea of the just transition mechanism now of the European Green Deal to really provide this risk-sharing public sector financing and make a public announcement so that there is trust by the population and also by the private sector that funds and funding will be forthcoming for just transition. I think that's really, really important to create, as I said, trust and also the long-term vision that you need to not only to provide that financing, but then also have the private sector and other actors chip in with their own financing. So I would say the trust, integrated policies, and really making sure that the workers and the population are part of the social dialogue and the just transition are really important to make sure that financing will come.
Thank you so much, Isabel. Now I see that Mustafa is also responding on the chat with regards to the social dimensions of the NDCs. Kusum, is there something you would like to add to that?
Yes, so there are few responses to it. Like first thing is on this inclusion of just transition into preamble and not including it for in the main text. It's all because of the provisions and how parties have do negotiate for this. So it is that when the Paris Agreement was being negotiated, maybe this was not brought onto the table by the party representatives, and that's why it did not come out so evidently in the Paris Agreement main text. But at least we are happy that just transition comes as one of the work program areas, and it was quite clear that it will continue in future for some time as well. So I do not see this as a very big setback to make progress. But definitely, if it gets its own importance in Paris Agreement, it probably could have been a little more better. On the financing part of just transition, I would like to echo what Isabel has mentioned. But to further strengthen it, yes, there is one of the barriers is also, as mentioned, that it is not fully integrated into the policies by governments. So the question also arises, like, who funds this transition? Whether it should come from public money or it should come from private money. So if private companies are closing their power plants, who bears the cost of this transition in a way if there is some compensation has to be made, or some kind of arrangements for retraining of staff has to be made, which policies guides them, and which are the mandatory guidelines available or policies available which they have to follow. So these kind of things, I think, because it is not clearly been integrated in these transition policies in the overall transition plan of the country, that also acts as one of the barrier of not having it very uniformly integrated in all transition plans at the country level. Thank you.
Linda, if I just wanted to maybe possible quick comment on the financing.
Yeah.
I think that if you look at countries that have developed national plans and strategies for a just transition, if you look, for example, at Spain, Spain is implementing a huge plan, the carbon, which is 250 million, with negotiated agreements between government, local communities, enterprises and coal mines for that transition to happen, and financing is part of it. If you look at Germany, coal commission's work, it's also funded. I think one challenge we have with financing for a just transition is that in terms of the needs within domestic jurisdictions, countries that have the resources are putting resources to do that. The challenge is when it comes to the extraterritorial impacts. So, for example, the fact that measures taken to reduce emissions from aviation will lead to decline in tourist demand in countries that depend a lot on tourism. If you consider the Pacific Islands, if you consider many countries in Mauritius, Senegal, and others. Now, who is going to pay for transition in the tourism industry? Because the impacts is caused extraterritorially, but the effects happen in a different country. So in those situations where there are challenges, and I think this is where the global negotiations on response measures are the right forum to offer solutions, because we are discussing national measures, but which have extraterritorial impact and require financing for a just transition. So I think it's important we keep these two dimensions. How do you finance a just transition within national programs, which I think is going well in countries that have resources, but the challenge is the extraterritorial impacts.
Excellent. Thank you for that. We have only 3 minutes left, and I still saw a couple of very interesting things on the chat. One comment from Argentina on the need for public and private sector agreements and sustainable cities. I saw a very specific question from India on, how about people who are on contracts and how does that work? And a couple of questions on skills training, and I think the importance of that. Gustavo, do you want to say something with regards to public-private cooperation agreements?
Hello. How are you?
We're good.
We're good.
Go
Do you
ahead.
hear me?
Yes.
Do you hear me?
Yes, perfectly
Okay.
fine.
Thank you. Thank you. My focus is on the problem of enhancing of agreements among public and private sector in order to make cities more sustainable in the future. And I think that in our experience in Argentina in last years, we have had different public and private drawbacks in order to enhance this commitment. And the problems are related to the normative issues and institutional frameworks of the different institutions too. And finally, the lack of political will in order to create a new atmosphere for change and in order to incorporate the problems just transitions related to energy sector. And then we have nowadays great problems in order to go on this challenge in our cities, in our society, and I think that scope on an holistic approach to these things is really necessary in my country, and expect to having opportunities to discuss these questions in this course, no?
Thank you so much for that, Gustavo. I also, as I mentioned, there is a question specifically on people on contracts, no? I think it's Pam Lee who is mentioning the situation in India with many people on contracts and the present situation with COVID. And I think there is an issue with skills training that maybe we need a last clarification. What exactly the concern is there? And then I would give the floor to Aslevis. Aslevis? Are you there? You said you would like to express a concern as far as the skills building is concerned. No? Otherwise, we leave that question for next time, and I would just like to ask the speakers if they have a last reaction on those topics, no? So especially also on people on contracts. Anything you can add there from your side? And then we wrap up for today.
Well, maybe nothing, but just one question that somebody asking how many countries have done national planning for just transition. I think there are many countries who are in this process, in South Africa with the National Planning Commission, in Spain, as I mentioned, in Germany, New Zealand has a just transition process, same for Canada. I think it's happening mostly in developed economies. And the challenge is how do we encourage more of our developing and emerging economies also to address just transition, because it's not just about energy sector, it is about agriculture, it's about tourism, and so this is an important dimension of climate action, and so we hope to be able to work with our member states in that direction.
Yeah, I would like just to answer the question about what about social inclusiveness and the informal economy. I think the Jackson example and also the South Africa example shows really well that it's just transition is not only about trade unions negotiating with governments. It's really a much broader concept now where different grassroots societies, women's group, youth groups, Future Friday for Future, etc. I mean, the whole movements need to come together to kind of see what kind of society do we want and what kind of economy do we want in social and in environmental terms. So I think the movement, the good thing is that the concept is now much broader, but then, the question is, how do you keep these different actors on board and make them go into a transformative direction?
Thank you so much, Isabel. There are still comments and questions on the chat box, but today is just the beginning of a series of webinars. And of course, you are also on the eCampus where we have the forum where you can post your comments and your questions. So I'm sure in the process they will get answered and they will be addressed. At this point, I would like to thank very much our three speakers of today for their inputs. I would like to thank the participants for their comments, for their questions, for being with us today. And we hope to see you again on Thursday for the next seminar, which will be about social dialogue and inclusiveness. So stay with us. Have a good, whatever it is, morning, afternoon, evening. and we hope to see you all soon again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.